Hello, everyone. This is another episode of Enter the Matrix, and this time we are not on our very scheduled or unscheduled show, depending how we feel on a given week, because we have Dan, who for some time I known as Somsar name because of Ines, and Dan was our coach at Champs Cup, and this episode is more of an extra because at one point after WDC, where I was head coaching, I got a query from one of the other WTC teams. What would you need a coach to do? Or like what are the requisites for a coach, what they should think about? We had the case of Ramon helping us at Eurotrash Cup in March, and also Dan helping us at Champs Cup. And I figured this is a very good thing to tackle about because usually when you're a coach, it is quite often that you're a coach because you were a player before, or then you do not need as much information how those team events actually happen. But when you're a newer player that is going as a coach for the first time for WTC, ETC, any kind of a small team event, you will not know how it unfolds and what is required from a coach before you actually happen to be at the event. And I figured this will be a good learning experience for anyone who's wondering what is it like to coach a new team and what are the takes that Dan has after doing all of that. So, welcome, Dan. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful, man. I'm the surname is gone. After Champs Cup, I'm now upstate Dan, apparently. Which to
So you've
explain
been upgraded?
briefly, I live in what Anthony calls upstate New York, which in the Hudson Valley we call just better Long Island. But I'm thrilled to be here. Glad we can talk about this. And yeah, man, this was like a real baptism in fire too. Because just to explain a little bit, I had done one 5-man team event played. And I went to my first GT in July. I'd been working with Anthony for about a year as a coaching client, kind of getting ready for a competitive push. And he reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to coach for Champs Cup? You don't live too far away." I at this point, I consider him a really good friend. And I figured, yeah, why not? And really had no prep going into it. Like Anthony was explaining the pairing process on the airplane as we were going in. So I had no idea what to expect. So it was genuinely one of the most fun experiences of my life. It was incredible. So to any aspiring coaches, I will say just go for it because I would say it's maybe like 1 or 2% less fun than being a player. It is really
it can be more stressful.
It's a different kind of stress though, like it's more you're worried about the overall, the overall score of the team and keeping everybody calm kind of falls on you sometimes. But if you're the type A personality that you like being in a little bit more control, it is phenomenal. It's one of the most fun things you can do in Warhammer, in my opinion. So
okay, so let's go straight into it. What was so fun for you in it? Because you were quite new to the whole idea, right? You mentioned that Anthony was teaching you what is pairings, and obviously there is like that pressure that you know that you will be coaching arguably one of the best players in the world.
Yeah.
So what was so fun to you when you were attending this event?
I think so. For me personally, I enjoy being in that ancillary role. I think as anybody who's an aspiring coach, I think one of the first things you want to do is sit down and figure out where your team sits kind of along like the general skill level, the general experience level. Right. So I think the experience of a coach for a team who isn't like, one of the favorites to win is probably very different than, what I was doing here. Right. Because like I realized probably like right around when we were doing pairings for round 1 that you guys know a lot more than I do in basically every respect. Right. Like, so one, it was a great opportunity for me to learn because I watched 36 really good, really experienced games of Warhammer, and not just learning the gameplay because you're bouncing around from table to table checking in, but watching the way you guys treat the game, the way you talk about the game, was just phenomenal. There's something about watching someone who's really just incredible at their craft just go and do their thing that I truly enjoy, and it's almost like I think a good analogy is like, I know a little bit about cars, right? Like, I know,
Mhm.
I can change the oil, I can change the tire, but then you hear two mechanics talk to each other and you're like, oh my God, I know absolutely nothing, right?
Yeah.
So a big part of the fun was, one, I got to be in the ancillary role, just keeping you guys fed, keeping you guys hydrated, keeping you guys informed. And which is something I enjoy doing, just baseline. And then add to that the fact that I got to watch, genuinely some of the best players in the world play and learn from them and talk to you guys, because you're also all incredible, funny, just generally warm, wonderful
We
people.
talk shit
Yeah,
so
it's
much.
great. And that's stuff that like you guys, whether you do it intentionally or not, have kind of a curated like online personality. So seeing you guys outside of that context was incredible. It really was,
I think John is the best example
Oh
in
my
our
God,
team.
yeah. Because I mean, John, I had met him for about 20 minutes a couple months ago before that, where he was, the nicest guy, perfect gentleman, because he didn't know me. And then, you get him back at the Airbnb and it's like, oh my God, like this is not the Art of War John that you expected at all,
Yeah.
So yeah, all of it, it really is like, I, I would say that was probably the most fun, was getting to know all of you guys. Um, and that, it's different when you're a coach too.
Yeah.
I think it's fun to see kind of from a step back perspective too, like how you guys all handle stress, right? Like how you guys all handle like, hey, I need a push, like watching Liam just be like, I go to Liam and I'm like, hey, I need a push. And he's like, sorry, buddy, I've already won 20 out. Like, it's the entire experience as a whole. I can't pinpoint any one specific thing that was,
Yeah.
like, wow, this is incredible, but just, I feel like I got swept up in just watching you guys do your thing. And it was just so enjoyable. And there were a lot of moments where I'm like, wow, I'm really glad I'm not playing right now,
Yeah. So you now mentioned not playing, and you mentioned that you enjoyed everything and like the whole
Yeah.
vibe of the event and getting to know us. But what would you describe your tasks were throughout the event? And also, I think let's add a little bit of spin into this, because you were asking me, you were asking Anthony, what do we expect you to do? And I think it is worth mentioning what would you consider your tasks before the event, because I think coaching role is not only at the event.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes it is before. So I think let's start before the event. What were you doing, or like how were you preparing, or what you thought your responsibilities might be, and how it changed when you approached the
Yeah.
event. So let's start before.
So I remember I reached out before the event and I kind of asked all of you guys like, hey, what do you want me to do? Because again, I feel like this coaching experience is a little different than what the average coaching experience might be, right? Because you guys really didn't need help on pairings, right? You don't need me looking at the table and saying, oh, I think you can push here, because you're going to know better than me, basically no matter what, right? So as far as like a game role goes, walking around from table to table, checking in with guys, finding out how the game is going. Something Anthony has mentioned, I think, on the main podcast that I thought was really, it was something I didn't think about at the time, but just how consistent you guys are too, right? Is like, if you guys told me it was a 12, more often than not, you guys were within like 1 or 2 points of that, right? But I think probably my biggest gameplay role was walking around and keeping, basically, you guys would tell me, hey, I think I'm getting a 12 here, and keeping a running tally of all 8 games, right? To say, okay, each guy predicts this. We're at, a 90, an 85, where does the round stand as far as an overall point score, and what tables could probably be a little aggressive and push and steal us extra points if we need it. Similarly, just going around to each table and letting guys know, hey, this is where we stand, right? If we're in a comfortable win, don't get aggressive. Don't do something like that. And that felt like that was my main role. We had a round where Francois just, it was a bad matchup. Everything went down, and you could see he was starting to get a little flustered, So one of the things I think you do as a coach is you keep an eye out for that, and you go and you say, hey, the round is comfortable. We're okay, because one of the things I realized very early was how the psychology of team events too is so valuable. You have to keep guys with short memories, because sometimes dice happen, and it's one of the beauties of the team format is if you have a bad round, you don't necessarily sink. Your teammates can lift you up, right? But at the same time, if guys start getting in their own heads and they start really tanking and tilting a little bit, that can warp the way an entire round plays. So I think kind of checking in on how guys are feeling mentally, how guys are feeling physically, and that kind of gets to the other part of it, right? Which is keeping people hydrated, keeping people medicated, keeping people fed, I think is a really undersold, for context for the audience, I'm a registered nurse. And it is like the love of my life. I genuinely love my job, but I think something that's really understated in Warhammer in general is how swings in your blood pressure, how swings in your blood sugar, like there are guys who will go entire events without eating. And it's been scientifically proven that your brain can't function like that, especially in a game like Warhammer, So I think there's kind of there's the gameplay side, which is really valuable, which is, keeping everybody informed, letting people know if we need a push, right? For example, in a round, I think it was against XPZ. Was that our really close round?
Yeah,
I think it was. Yeah. Where we won. I think we only won by 2 points, maybe between a win and a draw. And I'm going around the table, and it really is just going to come down to John's game, whether he can get a 16 or an 18. So kind of keeping him informed through the game, I'd like to think added some value where he might have taken a couple bigger risks than he normally would have in order to drive that margin up.
Yeah, but you were also pro that round updating others. I made some risky pushes in the middle of the round because I knew from you that it was needed. So throughout the event, you would consider yourself making, like you were walking around noting what are the estimates at any point during the round. So let's circle back to that. What did you do? Well, like, did you have any specific system, for example? So, every 30 minutes? Or did you have, for example, a sheet that had updates every time so you could see how it flows throughout the round?
Yeah. So what I had was I basically drew a 20-box grid, which had numbers kind of in a random order, 1 through 20. And I would circle the table and I would ask guys like, hey, do you feel comfortable making an estimation? And they would point to it. As I understand it, it's because you don't, you're allowed through the rules to, your opponent has to hear everything that you say, correct? But if you point to something on a paper, they don't necessarily have to see that.
But you first to have showed that piece of paper that you are showing to your players so they know that they are giving an estimate.
Correct. And so what they'll do is they'll just point to the number they feel most comfortable with. That goes in a notebook. I have everybody's game written down, whether they went first or second, as well as if that's where we'll track if anyone has a secret mission, because that can totally warp differential. So basically, I didn't have a set time. Basically, what I did was I kind of walked around after everybody was deployed, find out who went first or second, or if anyone fell after deployment, if their matrix had changed at all. So after that, I kind of at round 1, that was a time when you have a little bit of a break because everybody's turn 1, unless something goes horrible, usually doesn't tend to change the matrix too much. So that was the opportunity where I could get everybody fed, hydrated, that kind of stuff. But as far as the game goes, then I have a notebook which has a running tally, right? And what I tried to do, and hopefully I didn't bother you guys too much, was just check in at the end of every round. Hey, how are things going? And a lot of times I think you guys felt like you couldn't make a new estimation even when I checked in every round, but I felt like it was good to just kind of know that there was that presence there. You didn't have to come find me. Which was part of my question to you. Did you have guys with kind of a set time they like to round, or do you prefer kind of like I was doing where you just constantly rotating?
So what we've done at WTC was we wanted to make sure that our players also aren't tired. And that we do not approach everyone too often. And WTC has a specific ruling that you can only talk with a player at the end of the round.
Okay.
So it is slightly different at WTC, so you do not interrupt players when they are thinking, which makes sense. Like you do not want to, some people get thrown out of their zone and just misplay because they didn't have time to make a decision. And that's fair. But I think just being around is a very good way to do it, because sometimes when you hear someone can at any point just grab you and say, I have a potential to push. And I think you had a few of those situations,
Yeah, we
right?
definitely did.
When someone just asked you and you could, because you were constantly updating, you could see what was the forecast and like the prediction of what the score will be. So I think being kind of up to date, and I think good if you are not looking at round one or the finish of deployment, because everyone will do it differently. If it's Anthony or Liam, they will be done in 40 minutes. If it's me, I will probably in 40 minutes finish my first turn.
Yeah.
Right? It depends on the player. But I think the good idea is how you were doing it, like try to get information after every turn. And in a very long rounds, this is something that it is also up to players. But I remember when I was playing one of the guys that was playing T-Sons, he realized we had a lot of time. So he took like 20 minutes of his time to wait for the scores to come in from other games to decide whether he can push. And this is also something that you as a coach can relay that information. We do not have this information yet. Those players should have their turn two, which is, from my assessment of the table, very important, done in, say, 20 minutes. Can you wait 20 minutes? And sometimes player can just put time on their clock if they're playing on the clock, or if they're fine without clock. I still strongly suggest you play on the clock, even though I haven't played at the event. And then you can wait and make an informed decision after new scores come up. And I think this is a good approach. And you never felt like you were imposing yourself. You were just slightly coming over. Is there an update? And usually there was none. But because you were asking this, as I mentioned, if Ines had the potential to push, he would just run over to you excited like a kid, right?
Yeah.
So
right.
that was one thing. And regarding the event, you also mentioned like food, which makes sense. If you're a certified nurse, you also know way more about nutrition, especially you were previously competitive bodybuilding, right? So you know significantly more about what our bodies might need to have. And this is something that I find people are sometimes mocking coaches being like water boys. But from a player perspective, if you have an hour break between rounds and you get new pairing, say 20 minutes into that hour break, if within those 20 minutes you already had your food, you will go through like that initial digestion phase that you start your next game kind of not grumpy again. And also you have those 40 minutes that you can prepare for next round, because sometimes you do not have matrix ready for that next team because they weren't just on your radar and you prepared for someone else, or you lost the round where you were assuming that you will only play the top teams and you lost and suddenly you face someone else. And then those minutes that you can spend only thinking about pairings, updating estimations while you have food ready, it's just everyone is gaining like 30 minutes because your coach went for like 30 minutes to grab tacos like you did, right? Something nutritious instead of just pure junk food, which you would get junk food if you have that hour, because that's the only thing you can do. You will just grab a bag of chips instead of something that will be valuable to your body, right? So was there anything specific you had in mind while catering literally to the players?
I mean, like you said, like obviously I didn't want anyone eating junk. Anytime you have a group of 9 people who are so, culturally diverse and have such varying, taste buds, nutritional needs, it was mostly just like, what is close by that everyone can eat that won't like give everybody a stomach ache?
Mm-hmm.
So when you narrow that down, the criteria became like you said, like tacos, pizza, burgers, stuff like that. I think in like a perfect world, we probably would have done things that were a little more nutritious, but again, it comes down
It's
to what's
also
close by.
USA.
Yeah, especially Texas, right? Like, Plus, I will say, we didn't get a ton of time to just actually explore Texas too. So like that was at least my goal with like the tacos and the barbecue, stuff like that, is that we can experience a little bit of where we are instead of our only experience being the hotel conference room, right? So that was largely my goals. I also think benefit of hindsight. I think it would have been beneficial, less so to this team, but in other teams, is just like taking 10 to 15 minutes to step away from pairings and everything and just taking like a deep breath and
Yeah.
relaxing. I think there was a conference room attached off the main hall that we ate lunch every day. And I think getting into kind of the quiet and just sitting and, even, not waiting for those pairings to come in, I think was hugely helpful for everyone sort of clearing their heads, just decompressing a little
Oh
bit.
yeah, we were shit talking each other.
Yeah.
15
But,
minutes.
but that matter. It really does matter.
Yeah.
That, like, again, we talked about like the nutrition and the psychology of this game, I think are really underexplored. And how you sort of deal with the pressures of playing. And I think I'm sure you've noticed, especially in the United States, there's a lot of unhealthy behaviors amongst gamers.
Yeah.
That I think as a coach, you have an opportunity to sort of stamp out. You can be like, you don't have a choice. Like, you're taking this medication, you're eating, you're drinking, you're taking care of your body, whether or not you want to,
Yeah, there's a layer of also knowing your players.
Yeah.
And I think France at WTC also had that. They had a charcuterie board and like a cook that was making food for their players. And obviously, it is way beyond you being a solo coach for a team because it is already full hands.
Right.
But if you have few coaches, you can grab roles and give them to separate coaches that every single one of them does something different. And that was something we did, for example, at WTC, where I was mainly doing pairings and like making sure people did their estimations and I could do my work, whilst others were doing like as you did, the gathering estimations and getting the updates. And this was something that we had split the responsibilities between the players. And I think this is beneficial. And this is something that if you have few coaches in your team, and if there's a WTC team listening, I think this is very important because when everyone knows their responsibilities, they will make sure they do those as well as possible throughout the event. And if you do not have set stuff to do, you will kind of fizzle out in a sense because you will be trying too much at once. And unless someone is on ADHD and then having too much stuff at once is probably the best thing that can happen for them because they will just go in for those 3 days of event and then just not work for a week. But for usual human beings, I think it's also safe that coaches are working for the most of the day as well. Players are working within that 3.5 hour time frame, especially if they are not doing the pairings. So they are just do their game, do their estimations, and that's the end of the workday. But for coaches, sometimes there's also work at the end of the day in between rounds because you're making sure players get their stuff. And that's where I also wanted to ask before the event, because this is something that I've mentioned. What were your preparations like, knowing that this was your first time? Well, like, what have you looked specifically into?
Sure. You mentioned the ADHD, and my ADHD kicked in, and I just blew past your question. So as far as prep goes, like I said, I talked to you guys a lot about your expectations, which is something I would say if I could do again. We didn't do a ton of like team specific prep for this event, but I would have loved to see you guys play so I knew your board states a little better so that I didn't have to kind of check in all the time because like I had really no good feel for like how the Flamebringers into like GK matchup plays, right? So if in theory this was like a WTC or something where we had a couple months of prep time where we were trying to get everybody on the same page, I would have loved to watch a couple of games of that or just watch you play in general so that I don't have to check in so much. Be like, hey, how is this going? I can kind of look at the board and say, oh, okay, the important pieces are still on the table, so I can get a little bit of a better feel. But as far as preparation, I made sure I knew your guys' lists inside and out. I tried to help out a little bit with some of the matrix. One of the things that I had not done in my past team experience that I thought was really helpful was identifying those top teams that are going to be there and going and doing sort of list summaries for each of them. So instead of having to clip back and forth between like BCP, okay, what's this list? Like I have a general overview of every single list inside the matrix, you know? Even little stuff like I made pairing cards just in case they wouldn't have them at the venue. I printed out, you know, our matrix, all the terrain layouts. I think it was you who asked me to print those out.
Yeah.
And that was incredibly helpful looking back on it. Having every single terrain layout from the player pack printed out and in front of us, I think was hugely helpful in the pairings process where you guys could be like, oh, I want to play on this table. So I did that. I made sure I knew your guys' list really well. I tried to be pretty familiar with what you guys had identified as the top teams, what they were bringing, and kind of knowing our matrix generally off the top of our head. Aside from that, like learning the pairing process, I know I wasn't going to be very helpful there, but I felt like it would be important to at least know what was going on. So I would say those are the big things I did for prep. If I could do it again, like I said, definitely knowing how you guys play, getting to know you guys too. I think that's the benefit of some like teams like Poland who play a lot together and are very intimate is like, I would walk over to you guys sometimes just on a personal level and be like, hey, how's it going? And like, Pumbaa is one of the most pessimistic people I've ever seen play Warhammer. Like,
yes.
Holy shit. Like I remember every single time he in his Black Templar game, I keep walking over to him. He's like, man, this is fucked. It's gonna be a 7. It's gonna be, I think he ended up getting like a 12 or 13 that game. And that's when I realized I was like, oh, this guy thinks he's losing every single game. Because I just like bad news after bad news every single time. So like getting to know your players and how they react to stress, which plays back into like knowing when your guys might be tilting a little bit and when to intervene, I think matters a ton. Because like, again, or like Liam, right? Like Liam, I'll check in with, and he's like, oh, it's like a 16 or a 17. If he told me a 16 or a 17, it was a 20 every single time. Right.
Yeah.
So like knowing your, like, if I could do it again, knowing you guys and how your sort of estimations work and how you view the game would have been really helpful for kind of generating a more accurate prediction than what I was actually getting.
Yeah, fair. And I think there's a lot to it because in Poland we also knew certain like psychological aspects of players in our team. So some people would be, as we mentioned, pessimistic. Some people I knew wouldn't, for example, want to play the blast game, like being the one that's blast, because that's just not their mentality. They like to get high scores instead of getting the very grindy matchups. And this is something that you need to know when you're also assessing your team comp, which didn't really come into play at Champs Cup within our team because we're all very balanced. But when you have a team, this is important. And there's also important, as you mentioned, like with Francois, like if you're getting a bad game, some people need help to recover from that because they can get into their head. Not everyone, but knowing that also will let you like grab that person. And for example, we had a separate coach that his role was only to make sure that all of the players are fair psychologically, that everything is okay. And because he's studying psychology and he's getting a degree in that. So having all of that in mind really helps out. And I also agree with the fact that understanding the meta can be important, but I find this can be quite hard to do when you're thinking about like WTC, especially after a new release. Like say we are thinking now about WTC. If you only have a month after the new rules change, there will be so much that you cannot possibly be up to date as a coach. And maybe then you will have a separate coach that's only his role is to be up to date and do pairings. Like it was mostly me in our team at WTC. But then others will do other tasks. And that's just how you should split it between the players and between the coaches. And yeah, I agree with all of that. And throughout the event, what was like something that stood out to you that you didn't expect at all in terms of coaching or what you had to do that it just came up and you had to find a solution at? What's something that you had no clue about?
The one The one thing I have two. The first one that stands out to me is one, how much physical work it was. Like I went back and looked at like my Apple Watch data,
Yeah,
and I had done like 20,000 steps in just small circles every single day of the event. Like I had no idea I was going to be this tired and this worn down at the end of that.
yeah,
So because you think of coaching, especially for a team like this, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to be hanging out all day. Like, no, if you're coaching, you are going to work all day long. So I think you need to be ready for that. And I wasn't as prepared as I wished I was for that. The other thing I would say is just the general need for rules knowledge, right? We had like a very weird corner case, WTC ruling versus Games Workshop ruling, multiple judges involved in John's game against Dark Angels.
hmm
And it was one of those corner cases where it's like, there are 6 of the best players in the world here, and nobody seems to totally know how exactly this plays out, right? So thankfully, going back to my preparations, I also had a hard copy of the WTC FAQ printed out,
okay,
because one recommendation I would say to anybody going to any event is print everything if you're able to, because you never know how like Wi-Fi or service or anything is going to react when you're inside a big venue hall like that. But we ended up getting to a solution to that. I believe, if I remember right, the issue was 10 Deathwing Knights had charged the Tantalus,
yeah,
and we needed to know if they had to actually base the model or base the hull
yeah,
in order to prevent a disembarking unit or something like that. And we ended up going through, like, we had to go and get a judge, we had to look through multiple, it was like a WTC ruling that actually referred you to a GW ruling on a rule that even
yeah,
the judges weren't familiar with, right? So kind of managing everyone's different thoughts on the matter, right? Managing, and I will say to John's credit, to his opponent's credit, everybody handled it amazingly, but like it's one of those situations where it's a tense end of a game. This totally determines whether or not it's a win or a draw this round,
yeah,
right? And I was like, oh, I remember thinking to myself, like, oh, this could get a little heated here if people take this the wrong way. And to everyone's credit, they managed it wonderfully. But I guess I just assumed that everyone, at that high a level would just know every single rule in every single corner case. And that's just not the case. Like I imagine at WTC, there are weird judge calls and rulings that have to be made at the table
yeah,
as well, and I think understanding that process and how judging works, how all the people at the table came to, I think, a decision that felt fair and okay for everybody. And my involvement in that, right? Like going to get the judge or the original judge made a ruling, and to the event's credit, their judging system was phenomenal, right? If a first judge made a ruling that you didn't feel was correct, you could always go to the head judge, which is what we ended up doing this round.
hmm
And I think knowing that process and watching that process work in action was really, really incredible. And it was something that I hadn't even considered prior to that. I hope that answers your question. But
yeah, yeah. And to follow up on this, I think it is important that players, when they are preparing for an event, they focus on their games a lot. So
yeah.
sometimes they will just not read every nook and cranny of a
Mm-hmm.
player's packet or the rules pack or whatever is required there. So having someone that will make sure that the admin stuff is done and that it is followed, like even dumb stuff like submitting into BCP
Yeah.
what are the pairings and on what board. This is something that coaches will do. Players do not have to worry about it. Or like here, players are not looking for a coach, and that's something that I'm used. When I had coaching goals, I just asked you to find a coach, not coach, a judge. So you would grab me a judge, and judge will settle this, and we'll just continue playing. And that's the way to do it. And there's usually every event will have something specific to their rule set. Like WTC mentioned that as a coach, you couldn't just approach the player before the end of the round or scoring or tallying up, so you do not interrupt them. And this is very important that you, as a coaching staff, know all those rulings and make sure that the players are aware, so they can notify you when they can give you update, for example. And those are things that I, as a player, would not really like to think too much before the event, but at the event, get to know all of it from my coaching staff, just to have less of a mental burden.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head at the very beginning. I would say for any new coach, if there was anything I picked up from this experience, I think the best coaches just take everything except the game off the plate of the players, right? Like your guy's job is to show up and get whatever score you predicted, and that should be it. Everything else should be secondary. And as a coach, anything you can do to make that easier is what you should be focusing on.
Yeah. And to your credit, you were also helping us with like making burgers or driving us to the venue, right?
Yeah.
So there's always external help, which, to be fair, like, thank you, but like other player could also grab it in the evening, because it's also like distressing stuff that you can do. Just flipping burgers is actually quite chill when you get to talk.
Absolutely.
But this is another thing that you can do as a coach to make sure that players do not have to think about it. Or like when you went for grocery rushes middle of the round to grab us something that we didn't have. So yeah, it is very important. Is there anything like, now that you've coached, you mentioned a few things like getting to know us better. Was there anything else that you've learned that you would change, or like, you know, that you've done wrong looking back at it with the benefit of hindsight? Anything else?
I mean, I captured like I would definitely reinforce like knowing your players, like knowing you guys as people. Like my hope would be when you guys are in my neck of the woods for Battle of Salvation, I can coach you guys again, because I think I'll know you guys a lot better just as people. You know, and it's fortuitous that you guys are all just generally wonderful people. I could imagine in something like WTC, a coach's role in managing those personalities, you know, and getting everybody to work, you know, doing the actual, like, more of a sports coaching concept, right? Where it's like making sure everybody's capable of working together, you know, everything's, and honestly, I think a lot of that plays back into the keeping everybody fed and hydrated and stuff, because people are just bigger assholes when they're hungry and tired. And so I think I think that's really what I would harp on more than anything else is it is very easy from the outside looking in to see teams as just a bunch of guys lining up playing games, and, you know, the winner wins. There's so much more of a depth to the way the team's format works than I would say. You know, I wish, looking back, that I had been able to coach more so that I could do a better job. That's probably like a cop-out answer, but that's what I would say. Like, if I think from my experience that the actual role of like a coach is something that more people should be looking at doing as a role, you know? I think for someone like me, like, my schedule always isn't totally conducive to playing a lot of competitive events. And I don't like showing up to events where I'm not totally prepared, because one of the psychological aspects we talked about was I get very frustrated at myself when I lose, and I get even more frustrated when I'm letting my team down, you know? So as like, if I were to play for this team, you know, I'm not on the level of any of the guys who are playing there, right? So I think if by some fluke I would have had to play, I would have been very frustrated at letting you guys down. So the ability to be involved, be around you guys who are all awesome, who I now all consider friends, you know, and doing that supportive role that I personally enjoy, it was an incredible opportunity. And I think more people should give it a try. Like, you know, if you're going to a random local 5-man, just bring your buddy, you know, let them be around this, let them, you know, help you. And it's going to be just such a wonderful opportunity for everybody involved.
So I think there's a weird parallel that I can draw. I have a very good friend from uni that doesn't play 40K, but I took him for one event, and since then he's a bartender at all WTCs
There you go.
because he just does it to meet people, right?
Yeah.
And it is
Yeah.
about the community. But I think about preparing before and getting to know people. I think when you're a coach, it is also really nice to be a person that, if you have a wider coaching staff, if you have resources and you can do it, you might take an army that is not represented within your player group. And this event, we didn't playtest before the event. But when it comes to WTC, you playtest a lot. You'll identify, say, a pattern that there were all Bringers of Flame Sisters list. They change slightly, but this is a quite structured archetype at a given point. So what you can do as a coach, just take that list and before the event, play a few test games so you can give feedback from that army's point of view if you do not have Bringers of Flame Sisters list in your team comp. And I think this is very important that you have that knowledge that you can relay to players, because sometimes the pairings will be very vibey, how you feel about a given matchup. But when you actually play it, it might completely change how the game develops. So say we didn't have Hypercrypt. And I think this was the biggest problem at this event, because Francois had a misprediction into Hypercrypt and Pumba had a misprediction against Hypercrypt. And none of our players were actually Hypercrypt players. So we were all vibing about this specific list and army. But if you can make sure that one of your coaches knows that army, or your broader practice group knows that army, it is also very beneficial for the team, because just second guessing all the matrices or asking questions where you disagree is also a very valid way to help out your team.
That's actually a good point. And like I said, that is actually one of the things I would change, to jump back to that question, is there was a little bit of like starstruck, like, oh, I can't speak up here because these guys are so much better than me. I don't know if it would have actually changed anything or helped anything, but like, I think I would have been a little more vocal. I could have been a little more helpful if I was a little more vocal at times.
Yeah.
And it plays back into that know your team kind of thing. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine part of the advantage of like the WTC coaching staff, right, is that they have a little bit more of a voice of authority, I would imagine, because they're representing the actual organization. So being able to step up, let's say, for example, and be like, hey guys, we need to go to bed because it's, 11 or 12 at night and we have to be up at 6 for the next round, stuff like that, I think would have been beneficial to everybody. But like, I'm just a guy, right? So if I tell you all to go to bed, you're going to tell me to go fuck myself, right? Whereas like having someone who's a little bit more of an authority figure as the coach, who kind of speaks with the voice of God, I think could be extremely helpful. This event was also just to have fun, so less so, but like in a WTC perspective, having a coach who has the backing of everyone else, like, hey, what this person says goes, would be, I think, very, very helpful going forward as well.
Having an adult in the room to make sure everyone is making the correct decisions, because 40K is getting more and more professional.
Mm-hmm.
It is not only a tabletop war game now, but is slowly becoming more of a like up and coming sport. And I have one more question, because I think it is very close to what we just talked about, and that is that you felt starstruck and whatnot, and sometimes players would ask you about pushing or not, and you mentioned that you wanted to learn how a specific game goes, or like how specific army plays, because by doing so you could better assess how it is going for the whole round. Because sometimes also players would fill in their scores in an app, or do not have a printed out score sheet that you could follow through, which, by the way, is also very important that you do. Every single player should have a common approach to scoring, so your coaches can see the scores at any times. But coming back to what I wanted to say, people would ask you to push. What was your approach to that? Only just seeing if we need 2 more points to get, say, a win or a comfortable win, or were you like even sometimes thinking about asking someone else their opinion during the round? Say like a player like Liam ended their game after 40 minutes, like,
A couple of things I will say. We did sort of pre-round meetings, like after pairings we got together, and you or someone else would identify the players who had an opportunity to push in the rounds. That was extremely helpful for me because then I kind of knew, right, if the score was looking bad, who I could find and say, hey, we need a push. The I the when players ask to push, usually, and this is what whenever I train new nurses, this is what I say too, always identify who your adult is and go find them. Right. So I knew you and Anthony and Pumbaa were all really big into the pairings process and very clearly had a good grasp on who could push when and how. So if I ever felt a little bit unsure, I knew I could always just come to you, once the round ended, or whenever you could have a break to be like, hey, here's what's going on. And here's what I'm feeling. Is this correct? Or sometimes I just came to you and said, what do I do? Do I tell them to push or not? So that was generally one of the things I actually really enjoyed was how sort of it felt like it was by committee almost, right? Like a guy would come and say, hey, do I need to push? Or I have an opportunity to push. What do you think? And I could go to a couple of you guys and say, hey, here's the situation. What do you think? Thankfully, most of our rounds we were comfortably ahead enough that nobody needed to do a really big push. But I think the one, John, I feel like every round 2 was like, hey, I have an opportunity to make a push. Should I? And I remember the first time he did it, I was like, I have no idea. So I ran right over to you and you were like, no, we're fine. Tell him to calm down. And that's what we did. But
yeah, and it is worth mentioning, I will interrupt you here, that, for example, at WTC, as a coach, you are not allowed to talk to players during the round. So sometimes having, and this is circling back to the fact that I mentioned, having one coach that is very knowledgeable about all the armies and pairings, this is a moment that you can have that one coach on your team. And for example, that was me at WTC. One of our coaches would just grab me and talk with me about it.
Yeah.
And having a certain person that has that role is very, very important.
And that meeting at the front of the round was so valuable for me, not knowing that. So for you guys to identify, hey, here are the guys who are going to have opportunities to push. Yeah. So that I think even if we were not allowed to talk to anybody during the round, I kind of knew who our guys were that could push. Thankfully, usually it was Liam and Anthony who were in like round 3 after 45 minutes into the round. So it was a little hard. That was the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because we had guys who played at such different game paces that sometimes it did make it really hard to come to somebody and say, hey, we need a push, because like Liam and Anthony are already done by the time I know that, you or somebody else is struggling, So do you ever discuss kind of saying to your faster players, like, hey, you need to slow down a little bit so that we can keep information constant?
I think this is a very good point. I don't think we ever had that conversation within the team, but I think it is important because I look at this, time is also a resource. And you can draw a parallel how, for example, in Magic, your health is also a resource, right? And those are things that you also can manage. And I think so, unless you are, tabling opponent by turn 2, finishing your game an hour earlier than others and the score is like 11-9 might just be a wrong call, because you are in that way hindering the opportunity for your team to get more points. Whereas if you just slow down and made sure to some extent that your opponent also slowed down, because at the very beginning of the game, I do not mean this in a way that you just force your opponent to do something, but you set the tone at the very beginning of the game. Right. When you had that initial conversation about what do we do with cocked dice, what do we do with that, how I want to play by the intent, like the initial conversation. Ines had a very good video about it, if anyone is interested. And when you do that, you can also set that tone that I will play slightly slower because I want to make sure that whatever happens during the round, my team can recover. And I think if you are in that drawish region, using all your time is very beneficial. If you are already in a position that you are scraping 4 points by turn two or winning high by turn two, there's usually not much that can be done because you're already at that point of I will try to grab as many points as I can. But if you are playing slow, and I really liked, and this was the first time I ever encountered this, was John when USA played Poland in 23. That he was looking for the updates and he took no, he was playing against England, I think, not against Poland. But when he was playing Mani, he took 30 minutes of his time off just to wait for what's happening to make sure that he's updated. And I think this is important. This is not something that you as a player will think about because you're just playing game, you want to get your game through. But when you're reaching that next level, you want to spend your 3.5 hours that you have assigned to make sure your team is getting the best out of your game and not that you're off as quickly. Which, to be fair, in our team, we had Liam, Anthony, and Ines who are just speed demons. So this doesn't really apply. But yeah, that's my take on it.
It plays into that psychology too, because I've thought about this a lot. Is that's kind of those guys' MO too, right? Like that's how they like to play their game. They're locked in. They're playing quick. They're pushing, and it. I don't think it's any surprise with the list that they have, and the way that they play, that they were the top scorers on the team, right? So I think it's a little bit of a balancing act of trying to get them to slow down a little bit without totally killing their entire style of play.
Yeah. Also, playing quick is beneficial for you as a player sometimes because if you are used to it and opponent isn't, they will try to match it. So they will make more mistakes because they try to match your tempo, and there's something psychological about it. So it is important that you also, as a player, know to slow down.
Yeah.
You have time. You have allotted time. If you're by turn two, you burned 35 to 40 minutes out of your 1.5 hour, that's absolutely okay because those are the most important turns, right? You do not have to speed run it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Because I would think in a perfect world, like from a coaching perspective, if everybody could be done at almost the exact same time, that way I can swing around to every single person and be like, hey, we're done. What are we doing? How's the round feel? That would be great. But unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. So,
So do you have any more questions? Anything popped up into your mind that you wanted to?
Trying to think here. I'm curious kind of from your perspective as a coach, if there was anything you thought I might do differently or better. There was anything you noticed. I know you asked me all those questions, but
yeah, I really don't have anything that stood out to me negatively, right? I was really happy, and I think we are gifted that when we create those super teams, when it was Eurotrash, or here, when someone knows that they're a coach of such super team, they will put in work because they know they feel like the lesser part of the team.
Yeah.
And I think this is also something that we try to be accommodating as those super teams because you are as important as the rest, even if not sometimes more important, because one player can sometimes falter in such team, but if none of us get food, it is way worse.
Yeah.
So I do think I do not have anything that stood out to me. I just, if anything, no, there's nothing, really nothing.
So, I think looking back, having two coaches would have been incredible.
Yeah.
Because I will say it is a lot for one person.
Yeah.
Thankfully you guys felt really comfortable in your pairings, but a lot of times the stuff I was trying to do in between rounds bled into the pairing time where I wasn't back in time, whether it was just like running to target or, just running around trying to get everybody ready.
We were doing pairings, you were doing something, and then we needed for example, terrain layouts, right?
Yeah.
And you weren't there, so we didn't know where it was.
Right.
If we had a dedicated person who's there, and the other person doing groceries,
yeah. That's the other thing I'll talk about briefly. You asked about just sort of things that I brought with me to the event. I was really pleased. I just literally, like I said, I printed out the entire player pack. I had 2 copies of that. I had scoring sheets. I printed out the WTC FAQs, and just having those all in one binder in one place, so people, so you guys, hopefully, unfortunately, I guess I didn't do a good enough job. So you guys knew where to find it if I wasn't there, or I had it.
We eventually found it. It is not like
good.
we couldn't. It's just if you have a person whose responsibility is that, you know who to reach out to.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
1 second.
So yeah, now that Dan is taking care of his dog, I think this is very important. That I think the coach's role is, to summarize it, starts before the event, and it also spills over throughout, before the round, during the round, and in between rounds.
Yeah.
This is a job that takes nearly whole day, and there are ways that you can help out that you might not have thought about. And I think this is very important, that you identify how big of a coaching staff you have and split the assignments and responsibilities between the players way before the event, if you have time and many coaches. Or if you're a one-man army in that case as a coach, you might also split those responsibilities with players. Like say, okay, I will not touch your estimation matrices because I do not have capacity to do that, or I am not good enough, or I do not have experience. This is my first event, and I don't feel comfortable doing those short summaries of lists because I might miss out on something that was important. And I just don't know what's important in lists. So let's say, like, what was the weapons on like a Dominion squad? You might just skim through if you do not know, but it might be impactful for a specific matchup, right? And those are the small things that you can make sure with your team. And it all boils down to communication. Like, you need to communicate what are the responsibilities and identify what you need to do before the event, before the round, during the round, and in between rounds. And like before the event, you might be doing, like Dan mentioned, getting to know your lists, preparing the player packs, preparing, like you had even spare pairing cards or whatnot. Like you had stuff that in case someone forgot something because they are lazy bum and they fly from Europe. Hi, that's me. I'm the problem. It's me. Then you will end up helping them out. And this is something that you might make sure before the event, or make sure that you will be doing all the groceries during the round. You might split the responsibilities, that someone will be going grabbing water for the players, and you will be the one responsible for grabbing all the estimations. And between the rounds, you might be grabbing food, or after the rounds. It was something that we've done at WTC. We had 2 of our coaches leave the event earlier, grab our orders in, and on the way back to the hotel, we just sat down at the restaurant with food ready. So we just ate the food, got like 20-30 minutes of just decompressing, sat down, did estimations, and by 10 p.m. everyone was ready to go to bed, except the people who were responsible for doing pairings. But they also were people who weren't doing the playing of the game. And I think this is also important. If you have big enough coaching staff, I think spilling over the responsibility of doing pairings to players is not great, because this is another thing they will have to think about. And if you can make sure that only 2 coaches, for example, like we did in the Polish team this year, stay up and make sure they are well rested for doing the pairings, and then they can, go take a nap. This is another case where you can make sure that players have less to think about. Because if you have, and I think this is a problem for a few teams, like say USA, they had trio doing pairings, being Sean, John, and Eric, who were also playing armies. So you couldn't only focus on doing your games and testing, because you also had to do pairings, when we had 2 people who were just focusing on doing pairings. And this is just communication, sharing responsibilities, and making sure everyone knows what they are responsible for, so they can do what they do the best. And I think if you were a player, you can also identify what were your issues. Like the food, like sometimes at the event, you cannot get the food. So, well, you realize that you're a coach, you see where are the nearest grocery stores, right? And stuff like that. So you realize whether you may be needing a rental car, which is obviously another case to think about, but if you are going to another country, you might just rent a car so you can do groceries and still take players around the city or whatever, drive them, like it was in our case in Dallas. Like, I cannot imagine going around Dallas in Ubers only when we could grab a car, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Anything else you want to add on a closing note?
No, I'm really glad to be here. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for having me, man.
Yeah. Thank you
Hopefully
very
we'll
much
get
for.
together soon. I'm excited for you to see lovely upstate New York
One day.
one day.
So, for any of our listeners, this was more of an extra episode. And sometimes when we get good ideas what to do, just shoot them to us. You can suggest them if you go support us through Patreon. Then you can get access to our Discord, or sometimes you can even shoot a question within the comment section on YouTube. And if you do so, we might find a topic that is important that hasn't been really touched online. Because I think coaching as a specific thing was always like mentioned that it is very important. Like, you hear people praising their coaches, but it was never really talked about.
Yeah.
So if you would like me, Dan, or maybe I could grab some other coaches from other teams to follow through on all the questions that we had and follow up and give more information about it, ask us.
Definitely.
We'll be very happy to help you out.
Yeah. I'm in the StatChat Discord if anybody wants to talk to me about my experiences. I'm very bored and lonely.
Upstate done.
Reach out.
Yeah. So thank you very much for coming, Dan, and maybe see you in the next one.
Yeah, sounds good, man. Awesome.